Airline Pilot Guy, episode number 92.
Flight 209er, you're cleared for takeoff.
Roger.
LA departure 123.9.
Roger. Less than
Hello, you're listening to the Airline Pilot Guy Show, the view from my side of the cockpit door. I'm Captain Jeff, your host, broadcasting live from Studio 930 in Springfield, Massachusetts. In this episode, the American-US Airways merger. U.S. regulators approved the creation of the world's largest airline. More news and feedback, including the 1500-hour rule, density altitude, ACARS, windy days in Brussels, and much more. So, get all settled in, tray tables and seat backs in their upright and locked positions, electronic devices powered on. Flight 92 is ready for pushback. Hello, and welcome once again to the Airline Pilot Guy Show. And as I mentioned, it's episode number 92, and this is being recorded on Wednesday, the 13th of November in 2013. And if you're watching the video, now this is primarily an audio podcast, so if you're watching the video, understand that this is really aimed at the bulk of listeners and supporters of the show. It's an audio, downloadable audio podcast. But if you just happen to be looking at the video, you'll see that I'm wearing, you're probably wondering, what in the heck is he doing? And well, I have my Bose Aviation 10 or Aviation X headset that I bought way back in right around 2000 or so when I checked out as a captain on the 727 at Acme. And I've had the headset all these years and it's still working great. And I don't normally wear it for my podcast. However, I seem to have misplaced my earbuds that I normally use and wear and listen to podcasts and music and such. And so I had to pull the old headset out. This is exactly what I use when I'm flying, so this is what I look like, except for I'm in a uniform. And I usually have my microphone, the boom mic, right in front of my mouth like that. But that's just getting in the way right now because I'm not using the boom mic of this thing. I'm using a nice professional Heil PR40 microphone, if you're interested. So I have a little fitting, an adapter jack, that I can plug the 1/4 inch from the headset into the jack, and then it turns into a 3.5 millimeter or 1/8 inch approximately stereo jack. Plug it into the whole configuration here. Another thing that I ended up doing a little bit differently, I was trying to cut down on some of the equipment that I haul around with me, and so I didn't bring my mixer with me, and instead used or am using a little bit different setup today. And I neglected to throw one cable that I needed in my backpack, and so I'm recording this directly to the iPhone, which is what I'm using for the video. And I'll pull the audio off of the movie, and that'll be the audio for the audio downloadable podcast. Again, probably for most of you, information that you really don't care about. TMI, as my kids say. Too much information, Dad. So, let's get on with the show. So, I guess probably the best thing to do... Oh, no, before we do that, let me go over here to my soundboard and play this. I think you'll recognize it. If you can hear it. I can't. Here we go. I love coffee, I love tea, I love the Java Jive and it loves me. Coffee and tea and the Java and me. A cup, a cup, a cup, a cup, a cup. All right. Now there might be a little bit of, I may be a little bit out of sync with that because the setup has a little bit of latency in it. So I'm speaking, but my ears are hearing my voice about, I don't know, fraction of a second later. So it's a little irritating, but I think I can deal with it. So the Java Jive's playing. You all know what that means. That means that I'm going to talk about the Coffee Fund. Now, the Coffee Fund is for many things, one of which is coffee, caffeine, one of the staples in an airline pilot's life, at least for us old geezers. I think most of the younger guys don't drink coffee anymore. They drink Diet Coke and other things like energy drinks and that sort of thing. But us old guys, we still drink the coffee. And it's this is hotel coffee, so. And it's cold. Oh well. But the Coffee Fund is for supplying me with caffeine, and also I can buy beer with it and wine with it, and of course, more importantly, it helps me offset some of the costs of doing this podcast. Whoops, I bumped the camera. Sorry about that. Hope it didn't make you sick. The costs of hosting my media files at Liberated Syndication and hosting of my website, etc. So thank you one and all who have contributed in the past and are considering contributing in the future to the Coffee Fund. So without further ado, let's read the list of those who contributed to my fund since my last show. We have Justin, Theodore, Samuel, Juliet, and Ian, and an anonymous donor who has donated several times, and thank you very, very much for your generosity, Mr. Anonymous, or Mrs. Anonymous. I'm not sure. All right. Thank you, Ink Spots, recorded in 1940, the Java Jive. Because I love coffee, I love tea, I love the Java Jive, and it loves me. All right. So, let's go back here to my soundboard. Everything is just not exactly the way it normally is for me here, so bear with me. Here we go. Yes, I'm sure you've heard by now the big news in the airline merger, or the airline industry. Yes, the US Airways and AMR, American Airlines and US Airways, reached an antitrust settlement with the U.S. regarding their highly debated $17.2 billion merger on Tuesday, yesterday, in a deal that includes divesting several slots. The agreement, by the way, this is from Fox Business. The agreement, which ends a 3-month investigation by the Department of Justice, paves the way for a creation of the world's largest airline. The deal was originally valued at $11 billion when first announced earlier this year in February. However, since then, it has increased with the rising value of US Airways shares, which are up about 17% on the year. U.S. Airways shareholders will own 28% of the new company once the transaction is completed. The U.S. Department of Justice, which in August claimed that the merger would have far-reaching implications for the industry, filed a lawsuit to block the deal on antitrust grounds, though it did say it would be open to a settlement. And one of the primary concerns of this was just the sheer size of the airline. Combined, it would be the world's largest, with a virtual monopoly on slots at certain airports, including Washington, D.C. Authorities feared that would weigh on competition, forcing fares at U.S. Airways, known previously for its discounts, higher. The settlement calls for certain slots to be divested in major cities, including Boston, New York, Chicago, Dallas, Miami, and Los Angeles. At LaGuardia in New York, 34 slots consisting of 24 held by US Airways and 10 leased by AMR to Southwest Airlines, will be divested. It is also required to divest all 104 air carrier slots, or slots not reserved for use only by smaller commuter planes at Reagan National, as well as 2 gates and associated ground facilities at each of the remaining major cities mentioned above. Also, in one of the other articles that I was reading, the agreement also included the promise that the hubs in some of these major cities, Boston, New York, Chicago, Dallas, Miami, and Los Angeles, and a few others, I think Charlotte and perhaps Nashville, a couple other smaller hubs or mini hubs, they have agreed to not close for, I think, 3 years. I don't have that data in front of me right now, but I believe that's what I remember reading. So, Lynn Francisco writes, I just noticed a news report that says that the Justice Department reached an agreement with US Airways and American Airlines to allow these companies to merge, resulting in a company that would exceed the sizes of United and Delta Airlines in size. What are your thoughts on this latest merger? Well, I figured that this was going to be something that would be approved, and it was just a matter of time. And I think some of these concerns that the Department of Justice had were just kind of perhaps tactics to lessen the impact of the planned merger on some of the other already merged airlines and, of course, all the discounters in the country. But I never really thought that there was a serious attempt or a serious threat of the merger not going through. I mean, how could they not allow the merger? They allowed the United Continental merger, they allowed the Delta Northwest merger, and so it just made sense that this was going to go through. Let's kind of go back into history. Many of you listening to the show were not born when Congress passed the Airline Deregulation Act of 1978, or the long title, which just rolls off the tongue, an act to amend the Federal Aviation Act of 1958 to encourage, develop, and attain an air transportation system which relies on competitive market forces to determine the quality, variety, and price of air services, and for other purposes. See what I mean? That just rolls off the tongue. Anyway, work on this had begun many, many years before, but the act was finally signed into law in 1978 during the Carter administration. Let's see. Exposure to competition led to heavy losses and conflicts with labor. So after the Deregulation Act happened back in 1978, many people were saying, well, what's going to happen here is that all these big airlines are just going to merge together, and then we're just going to have a handful of huge mega airlines, and this is not going to help things at all. Those were the critics of the Deregulation Act. So some could argue that that's what's now occurring. Others would argue that the Deregulation Act, the deregulation of the airline industry here in the United States, has been a positive thing. Let's see, the Wikipedia article that I was reading from said that after this act passed, exposure to competition led to heavy losses and conflicts with labor unions for a number of carriers. Between 1978 and mid-2001, right before 9/11, 9 major carriers, including Eastern, Midway, Braniff, Pan Am, Continental, America West Airlines, Northwest Airlines, and TWA, and more than 100 smaller airlines, went bankrupt or were liquidated, including most of the dozens of new airlines founded in deregulation's aftermath. So back in 2008, so 5 years ago, a little more than 5 years ago, the CEO of American Airlines, Robert Crandall, stated, "The consequences of deregulation have been very adverse. Our airlines, once world leaders, are now laggards in every category, including fleet age, service quality, and international reputation. Fewer and fewer flights are on time. Airport congestion has become a staple of late-night comedy shows. An even higher percentage of bags are lost or misplaced. Last-minute seats are harder and harder to find. Passenger complaints have skyrocketed. Airline service, by any standard, has become unacceptable. That was, again, Robert Crandall, a former CEO of American Airlines back in 2008. Now, this in 2011, Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer, who worked with Senator Kennedy on airline deregulation in the 70s, wrote, "What does the industry's history tell us? Was this effort worthwhile? Certainly it shows that every major reform brings about new, sometimes unforeseen problems. No one foresaw the industry's spectacular growth, with the number of air passengers increasing from 207.5 million in 1974 to 721.1 million last year. As a result, no one foresaw the extent to which new bottlenecks would develop. A flight-choked Northeast corridor, overcrowded airports, delays, and terrorist risks, consequently making air travel increasingly difficult. Nor did anyone foresee the extent to which change might unfairly harm workers in the industry. Still, fares have come down. Airline revenue per passenger mile has declined from an inflation-adjusted 33.3 cents in 1974 to 13 cents in the first half of 2010. In 1974, the cheapest round-trip New York to Los Angeles flight in inflation-adjusted dollars that regulators would allow, so back in 1974, adjusted for inflation, the cheapest fare that airlines could charge from New York to Los Angeles, $1,442. Today, one can fly that same route for $268 round trip. That is why the number of travelers have gone up. So we sit in crowded planes, munch potato chips, flare up when the loudspeaker announces yet another flight delay. But how many now will vote to go back to the good old days of paying high regulated prices for better service, even among business travelers who wants to pay full fare for the briefcase? So that was a quote from Justice Stephen Breyer back in 2011. So I think that overall deregulation actually has benefited the airline industry, but I guess it depends on what perspective you're looking at. Has it benefited me as a commercial airline pilot? No. If you compared the pay rates or the amount of money that a captain at a major airline was making back in the 70s with what a major airline captain makes now, there's no contest. Those guys back then made much, much more. But, it was regulated by the government, and that worked against consumers. As mentioned in the quote from Justice Breyer, the cheapest they could charge for airfare between coast to coast was $1,442, and now you see the sales all the time. You can get a round trip ticket for under $300 coast to coast, including fees and taxes and everything else. So I think in the long run, this has been a good thing for the consumer, and again, inevitable that the large airlines would partner together to survive. And so that's my thoughts on the merger. I don't look at it as a threat to Acme Airlines. I think that overall this is going to be a good thing for the airline industry in our country. So those are my opinions and thoughts. What are yours? Okay. I think it's time now to... Oh, by the way, I'm doing another thing, yet another thing, a little bit new in this episode. I set up a timed playlist so to cap the amount of time that this podcast runs. And especially that last one, I think it was all the way up to almost 3 hours, 2 hours and 40-something minutes. And in an effort to keep these shows under 2 hours, right now I set a goal for an hour and a half on this episode, and I'm going to try to tweak that down, not twerk it, tweak it down to about an hour per episode. Now, that may mean that I do more episodes than one per week. Who knows? But we'll see how this works. So today, the outro music is going to start coming up very softly in the background, I'm hoping, and kind of cluing me in that it's time to shut up and end the show. So we'll see how that works. I know a lot of you like the long shows. Some of you, not so much. In fact, I had one of my listeners. Now, I'm sure that he's not listening at this point because he said he can't make it past 15 minutes. And I think I'm past 15 minutes already. Let's see. Yeah, I'm at the 20 mark. So this person, and if you are watching, you know who you are. Very funny guy. He sent me a video of listening to his mother-in-law in some airport somewhere, and he said that he couldn't take more than a certain number of minutes listening to his mother-in-law talk, so he compared me with his mother-in-law. You hurt me, man. You hurt me. So I know that there is a concern out there from many of you that the show is just way too long, and I agree with you. So we'll see what we can come up with here. So let's go over here and play this sound clip. I tried to adjust the volume on it. Let me try again. Oh, it's not working. Darn it. Okay. Third time is a charm, don't you think?
Captain, incoming message.
Thank you. Okay, let's go over here to feedback. Hi, Jeff. Recently stumbled across your podcast on iTunes, so please forgive me if you've already answered these questions in a previous podcast, as I'm still working my way back to listen to all of them. And that's happening more and more recently. A lot of people just discovering my podcast on YouTube or iTunes and just listening to some of the most recent episodes, and you can't really blame them for not being able to listen to my whole back catalog because it is just hundreds of hours of podcasting that you have to sit through. So thank you for apologizing for asking something that may have been asked in the past. I'm going to try to limit the amount of time that I spend answering questions on, what's your advice for me? I want to get into the airlines as a career, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I think if you just go back a few podcasts from this one, you'll find that I have answered many of those types of questions. Probably one of the best ones in most recent history would be episode number 90, in which my first officer joined me, and we talked a lot about what to do, how to get to where we are today. So I'll continue on with Charles' feedback. I like most... no, you know what? I remember now that I've already read his feedback. Okay, so sorry, Charles. Didn't mean to duplicate myself. Let's move on to Brad, and Brad sent me some audio feedback. Take it away, Brad.
Hello, Captain Jeff. It's Brad from Lawrenceville, Georgia. I have many questions, but I will stick to one for now. When using ACARS to get runway, weather, or clearance information, do you have to set the radio to a certain frequency? Keep safe, and God bless.
Well, thanks, Brad, for your very concise audio feedback and limiting it to one question. I love this kind of audio feedback. Thanks, Brad. So, no, you don't. The ACARS system, the little digital data box that we use to get a lot of information from our company and from the FAA, is a device that we get all the, as you mentioned, the ATIS information, the Automatic Terminal Information Service, the information about the weather at the airport, runways that they're using, any NOTAMs that are important for us to be alerted to, etc. That is one of the uses for the ACARS system. Another is getting our takeoff performance data, getting all kinds of information, both back and forth between dispatchers and other departments in our company and with air traffic control. And your specific question asked about ATIS. Do we have to dial in a certain frequency to get the ATIS information for a certain airport? And with the ACARS system, no. It automatically or automagically knows where it is and how to, what frequency to tune into to get the information needed. So it's nice. The ACARS is just there. If we want to get the ATIS for a particular airport, we just go to the proper page. We press the prompt for the ATIS, and we put in the K code, the ICAO code. So if we wanted information for, let's say, Bradley International, we put KBDL, and then hit enter. And we would, of course, you could specify whether you want the arrival information, departure information, etc., and push the button, and then a few seconds later, a little message light lights up on the screen. We press that message light, and we read the text information about the ATIS. And we can still do it the old-fashioned way as well. If we're within radio range, we can dial up using one of our VHF radios the actual ATIS frequency and get that information through voice, through our headsets or speaker in the cockpit. But it's just a lot easier to use the ACARS system to get the ATIS information. Plus, you can get ATIS information when you're well out of radar contact, because it's just going through a central digital database system, I guess. So that's how that all works. And by the way, the ACARS system, at least in the airplane that I fly, uses a third VHF radio to connect and get all of its information, its data. And I don't, again, know exactly how it does it, but it just does it. So there's no control head for that third VHF radio on my airplane. It just happens in the background. So thanks for your question, Brad. Vincent writes, Vincent is in Brussels. Actually, yeah. He said, here is your more or less faithful podcast listener and follower of SQPN, the network that I'm associated with, and an old acquaintance of Father Roderick in the Netherlands. I would love to have been in Boston this weekend. You can tell this is kind of old. It was back in October. But my current situation does not allow me. As you may recall, I live in Belgium, near Brussels, and its airport, Zaventem, which is the name of a village near Brussels. For that reason, the airport has a Z shape. Now, the airport is in the Belgium news because of changing its wind norms. According to the new rules made public by the air traffic control agency Belgo Control, from September 19th on, planes are allowed to land and take off in tailwinds of 7 knots instead of only 5 knots. The Belgian Guild of Air Traffic Controllers and the Christian Union ACV-Transcom maintain that this will endanger the safety of aviation at Belgium's biggest airport. The Belgian Guild of Air Traffic Controllers, BGATC, Marseille Moulemans, says pressure increases for the supervisor in the control tower. We are no longer able to decide long enough in advance which runway to use. This increases safety risks. Just think of a plane landing in wet conditions. Earlier, the Pilot Association, Belgian Cockpit Association, also labeled the new norms dangerous. Pilots are also unhappy with a new takeoff path towards Louvain. That means that planes have to fly behind each other for an additional 15 kilometers, some 9 or 10 miles, as they only turn off after they've passed the city. Maybe you could share your thoughts. What are the norms in the US of A? All right. And he says, have a wonderful time in Boston. Say hello to Father Roderick and to Inge, who made Vincent's website, Biofides, BIOFIDES.EU. Thanks for your answer. God bless, Vincent. Well, thank you, Vincent. Yeah, had a great time in Boston, and didn't get to see Inge because she didn't make it out this year. She stayed in the Netherlands, but I did spend quite a bit of time with my good friend, Father Roderick. So, what do I think? Or first of all, you said, what are the norms in the US of A? Well, I'm not sure if there's anything like a specific norm for all airlines that operate in the United States, but I do know that specific companies do have maximum tailwind limits that they publish and make us abide by. And for my airline, a maximum of 10 knots of tailwind in normal conditions, dry conditions, etc., and as long as everything's working properly on the airplane. Now, when you have some things that are not working 100% in the airplane, or you have some adverse weather, low minimums, crosswinds, well, that doesn't matter, but you have low visibility and perhaps braking friction issues. In other words, the braking action is reported as fair or poor, then we have even more stringent tailwind limitations. But in general, we operate with a max tailwind component of 10 knots. Now, in my experience, these past 25 years in the airline industry, you very rarely ever encounter a situation where you're landing with anything even approaching that 10 knot limit. By that point, usually the authorities at the airport will have made the decision to turn the airport around, which is a term that we use, but which means in general that they switch runway designations to better align the runways into the wind. So what do I think about this? I think that I agree with the Belgian Cockpit Association and the Belgian Guild of Air Traffic Controllers and the Christian Union ACV Transcom about the fact that this will increase the risk. And I wouldn't necessarily say that it's flat out dangerous. Again, it depends on the conditions. But I think that when you're allowing the safety provisions to be altered in a negative direction because you are trying to appease people that are complaining about noise, etc., I think that that's dangerous. That kind of thinking. So I don't know. Let's see what happens in Brussels. Whether they continue to keep this new tailwind limit, this increased tailwind limit in place or not. Thanks, Vincent, for your feedback. Now, this is from Jesus, and I'm actually going to meet with Jesus right after I finish doing this episode. And we're going to meet for some barbecue and some beer here in Springfield, and I'm looking forward to that. So, Jesus, let me play your feedback.
Hey, Captain Jeff, Jesus here. Been listening to your podcast for quite some time. I've actually was able to catch up from your earlier episodes to current and pretty much listen faithfully every week. I wait for Stitcher to come up with a little blue dot next to the show so I can, so it keys me in as that a new episode's out. Love the podcast. I love what you do, and I appreciate the time that you take to make this podcast. A little bit about myself. I am a private pilot, have been for probably about 11 years now. My exposure to aviation is pretty good. I'm also a reservist, an Army National Guardsman with a Army Aviation unit, and get to hang out with all the cool pilots that fly, our HH-60s, and being co-located on the base that's used with the Air Force, I get to see and be around some F-15s every once in a while as well. And we're also not that far from another airport that houses some C-5s. So I love the area that I live in only because of the exposure to aviation that I have. If you're ever in town again, laying over and from or into Bradley, give me a call and we'll go hit up this place called Theodore's. It has great barbecue. You would never expect it, and decent beer. So
I'll do that.
But I wanted to call in to see how much density altitude affects your performance. I know in the winter months, for myself, I kind of like to see the VSI peak out, over 1,000 feet per minute, which is great on those cold winter months or excuse me, cold winter days, and you're kind of light. But even on the heavier days, when full fuel, a couple passengers, it's just nice to see. Obviously, we fly aircraft that don't have a lot of performance, and we really enjoy it, especially if at any point we're flying on an instrument day or we're flying IMC. Anyway, I love the show. Thanks for putting it out there. Whenever you're around, please feel free to give me a call. We'll do lunch, and keep up the great work with the podcast. And I hope you have many, many great flights until your retirement, 10 or so years from now, and pass on that aviation experience to the rest of the world, and we'll definitely soak it up. Have a good one.
Well, thanks, Jesus. And as I mentioned, we are actually going to meet today, so that's cool. I don't know if I'm going to be as cool as those cool pilots at the places you work at the Guard, but I'll try. So, Jesus asked about density altitude. Now, a lot of places we go, you'll hear on the Automatic Terminal Information Service, ATIS, that when density altitude is significantly higher than the pressure altitude, they'll say something like, pilots are advised or warned to check density altitude. For me, at least at my company, all the performance data is computed by another department at the airline, so I never have to do any of these calculations to see whether or not our aircraft performance parameters are within a certain envelope, etc. That's all kind of done for us. But I can tell you that when it's cold and when the humidity is low, so it's a cold, dry day, the airplane does perform much more spectacularly than on a very hot, humid day. And that, of course, is because of this effect, density altitude. According to Wikipedia, my go-to source, density altitude is the altitude relative to the standard atmosphere conditions at which the air density would be equal to the indicated air density at the place of observation, or, in other words, the height when measured in terms of the density of the air rather than the distance from the ground. Density altitude is the pressure altitude adjusted for non-standard temperature. This article right here, now, there's something about this that doesn't seem quite right to me. And so I know I have some people out here listening to the show or watching the show who are much, much smarter than I am and get into the theory of aerodynamics and the science of flight and everything much more than I do. And I'm more at the practical end of things. But listen to this paragraph and let me know whether or not this is correct. Both an increase in temperature, pressure, and to a much lesser degree humidity will cause an increase in density altitude. Thus, in hot and humid conditions, the density altitude at a particular location may be significantly higher than the true altitude. Okay, I agree with everything except for an increase in pressure, and I'm assuming what they mean is the barometric pressure. It seems like an increase in barometric pressure would decrease density altitude or increase performance. I can see the increase in temperature and increase in humidity as having a negative effect on density, altitude, and performance. But I don't know. Am I all wet on this? Come on, you guys. You're really smart guys. Let me know if that paragraph is that statement is true. It's saying if you increase temperature, increase pressure, or increase humidity, you will also increase density altitude. Is that right? I know that the temperature and humidity thing is right, but not sure about the pressure. So anyway, in aviation, the density altitude is used to assess the aircraft's aerodynamic performance under certain weather conditions. And so what does density altitude affect? It affects the lift generated by the wings. A reduction in air density reduces the wing's lift. It affects the efficiency of the propeller or rotor which for a propeller, effectively an airfoil, behaves similarly to lift on wings. The power output of the engine. Power output depends on oxygen intake, so the engine output is reduced as the equivalent dry air density decreases and produces even less power as moisture displaces oxygen in more humid conditions. So aircraft taking off from a hot and high airport, such as Quito or Mexico City, are at a significant aerodynamic disadvantage. The following effects result from a density altitude which is higher than the actual physical altitude. The aircraft will accelerate slower on takeoff as a result of reduced power production. The aircraft will need to achieve a higher true airspeed to attain the same lift. This implies both a longer takeoff roll and a higher true airspeed, which must be maintained when airborne to avoid stalling. The aircraft will climb slower as the result of reduced power production and lift. And it goes into some detail about formulas for determining density altitude, and I don't want to go into all that. That's about as deep as I want to get into density altitude. But bottom line, Jesus, yes, we are affected by density altitude, and that first time you fly, it usually happens sometime in around this time of year. Let's say perhaps late September, early October, when you get that first really, really cold snap. You get in the airplane and you take off, and man, you feel like you're in a rocket. The jet engines are sucking down that really dense, cold, compressed air and just pumping out a lot more thrust than they normally do. The wings are producing more lift than they normally do, and you just your pitch angle is way up there, and you're climbing out like the old proverbial bat out of hell, whatever that means. So yes, we do see that the effect of decreased density altitude. So. All right. Thanks for your question, sir, and I hope I didn't mangle the science too badly there. Andreas writes, he has some feedback regarding the issue of keeping the seat-of-the-pants skill in the industry. And Andreas is from Sweden. So let's hear what Andreas has to say.
Good morning, Captain. My name is Andreas, and I'm calling you from Sweden. Here is an idea on how to keep the skill of seat-of-the-pants flying in the airline industry. Why not exchange some of the simulator time for some grass-field real-time glider flying? As a former glider pilot, I am currently not current, but I can still say that it doesn't get more seat-of-the-pants flying than this, with the traditional control column intact. You really have to manage energy, and you really have to work all the controls, especially the rudder, due to the larger wingspan to airframe ratio. The carrier will get more confident pilots, and it's probably a lot cheaper than simulator time and more fun. And you don't even have to get glider pilot licenses for all the captains and all the first officers. You just have to have a glider pilot teacher in the back seat going along for the ride. And I can't think of any reason why a glider flying club would not welcome both the business and the pilots. I'd love to get your take on this idea. Thank you for a great show.
Well, thank you, Andreas, and thank you for great feedback. And I agree with you. I think that would be a fantastic thing to do, but do I think that it will ever happen? Not a chance. There are so many things that liability and logistics and having to do this in fair weather and so many constraints on the airlines that have such a tightly constrained training schedule and everything else that taking away time in the box in a climate controlled environment to out there in the grass field, it's just not going to happen. But I would love to see it happen. I would love to get some glider experience myself, because I agree with you that nothing gets closer to real flying than up in a glider and experiencing aerodynamics firsthand. So I think it's a great idea. Unfortunately, I don't think it'll ever happen. But thanks for your feedback anyway, and let's listen to some more audio feedback, this time from Louis.
Greetings, Captain Jeff. My name is Louis Guillama, and I am a longtime listener, huge fan of your show, and I'm also a licensed private pilot, having been flying Cessnas and Pipers since I was about 19 years old, so about 20 some odd years ago. I do have one question for you, since I'm not familiar with the specifics of spoilers, since our aircraft don't have them. I have flown commercially quite a bit. I was a multi-million miler with American earlier in my career, and it always concerned me when planes would do what appeared to be somewhat steep turns and in the pattern while they had their spoilers out. So the question is, what effect does the spoilers have on the performance of the wing with respect to the stall characteristics? Does it increase the stall speed? I would imagine it has some effect on the stalling characteristics of the plane with the spoilers deployed, and then that would be further compounded with a steeper bank on the wings. So that's a question for you, and hope you have a great show today, and fair winds and clear skies. Take care.
Well, thanks, Louis, and I hope that I can answer this question. I think that I didn't actually do any research on this, but I can tell you I believe, and again, the academics that are listening to the show can correct me if I'm wrong about this, but or maybe some fellow pilots or non-fellow pilots. I believe that the way that spoilers affect the lift on the wing and stall speeds and stall characteristics, etc., is the same way that increasing the bank angle lowers or actually increases the speed at which the wing will stall. So in other words, if you're out there at a certain speed and you're in level flight, your margin from the stall speed is pretty high. As you start banking up to about 25 to 30 degrees, then the margin starts decreasing. It gets closer and closer to the actual stall speed. Even though you're maintaining the same speed, the stall speed actually is a little bit higher because of the aerodynamics of the lift vector and the drag vector and all these other factors in aerodynamics. I believe that putting out the spoilers has the same effect in making it an increased stall speed. So you have to be careful when you're really banking it up in the pattern or turning or whatever, and you're at a much slower speed, and you're putting out the spoilers. That may have an unintended effect on your stall margin. And of course, we have many systems in airliners that warn us when we're getting close to that stall speed. You know, if you don't sense the aerodynamic or physical buffet that you would normally experience when you're approaching the stall speed, which may actually be masking the actual spoilers out. You know, that has its own vibration and burble that actually may mask the normal indication as you're approaching a stall speed of a physical buffet. So we do have other systems on the airplane that will sense when you're getting closer and closer to that stall speed, and will warn you with the stick shaker or the stick pusher if it gets that far. Of course, you never ever want to get anywhere near the point at which a stick shaker is actually giving you a warning that you're getting close to your stall speed. So you have to keep that in mind when you're flying a high performance airplane and you're using the spoilers. So that and another thing that affects on some airplanes, I was just thinking about this, the 727. If you had the speed back and you had the flaps out, and then you pop the spoilers a little bit, it would really dramatically increase the roll rate. So you had to be very careful about, or at least know that you have the spoilers extended and the flaps are extended because you're changing the shape of the wing and the characteristics of the roll and everything else, that when those spoilers are out, you're really going to get a much improved roll rate. And so you have to keep that in mind when you had the spoilers out or you crack the spoiler panels. So that, as far as I know, is the way that spoilers affect the stall speed and stall characteristics of the wing. Again, anybody out there with a little bit more aerodynamic knowledge than I have, or academic knowledge of aeronautical stuff, you might want to weigh in on this one too. All right, thanks, Louis, for asking the question and putting me on the spot. Of course, if I had any sense at all, I would have listened first and then done the research, and I would have looked much smarter. But you know me, I'm not very organized. All right. I just realized that I have not been playing my little bumpers here. Let's play this. Oh, you can hardly hear that. Okay. More audio feedback from Marcus. Let's hear what Marcus has to say.
Hi, I'm Marcus Gray, Mr. Belt 1000 on YouTube. I'm a student pilot down here in Florida. I'm going up for my first flight next week. First flight I will be able to take control of the aircraft for maneuvering. And I was wondering if you had any tips that I could use while I'm doing this. Thank you for listening to this. Bye.
Okay. Well, first of all, Marcus, if you're watching this episode, I apologize for taking so long to answer your question, and it's very, very likely that by the time you are actually hearing me answer your question, you've already had your first flight. And I hope that it was fun and enjoyable, and I hope that it gave you some encouragement to continue on with your flight training. And I hope that not answering your question in a timely manner didn't have a negative effect on your experience. So do me a favor, if you're listening, Marcus, send me some more audio feedback and let all of us know here at Airline Pilot Guy how that first flight went. Now, if I had answered this in a timely manner, again, he sent this back in October 22nd, not quite a month ago. Again, as I say, it's probably very likely that he's already, you have, Marcus, already taken that flight. But what I would have said is to try to make the most of it, relax as much as you can. I think I mentioned in previous episodes that my first time at the controls of a general aviation airplane, I was like gripping that control yoke so tightly that my fingers were turning white, and I think that's where they get the term white knuckle flyer. You just look down and you're gripping that thing so hard that your knuckles are turning white. And if I just relaxed and kind of touched the control wheel kind of with just a few fingers and try to be as light on the controls as possible, I think that I probably would have done a better job. So I would have just said, try to make it as stress-free an experience as possible. Soak in everything from that instructor as much as you can. Really pay attention to everything outside the airplane. That's the other thing, that when a lot of us, I can only speak for myself, but a lot of us, when we're in the airplane for the first time, we're like holding onto that control yoke and staring at the instrument panel and looking at that artificial horizon, looking at the airspeed, looking at the altitude, and not wanting to, move your head up and moving your eyes out of the cockpit and looking outside, out at the horizon, over to the right, over to the left, really taking in and soaking in the excitement of flight. So that's what I would have said. Don't forget to do that. Even if you get off in altitude a little bit, or airspeed drops back a little bit, or gets a little bit too high, that's what the instructor is there for. He's not expecting you to be able to do it perfectly like he can, and you will, after a short period of time, be able to, manage to be right on your airspeed and right on your altitude all the time, or most of the time, without much effort. But yeah, if you're listening to this and you've not taken your first flight yet, look outside. Just almost be like a passenger and enjoy the heck out of it, because that first flight, that's what that's there for. It's to really kind of get a feel for what it's like to fly in a small airplane, feel what it's like to actually activate the controls and see and feel the airplane respond to your control inputs. And again, nobody's expecting you to be the best pilot in the world on your first flight. So just enjoy it. That's what I would have told you, and I hope that that's what you did on your first flight, Marcus. Thanks for your feedback, and hopefully when you send me some more feedback, I won't take so long to answer it. Okay, more audio feedback. This is great. I love audio feedback. This is from Andrew, so let's hear what Andrew has to say.
Hello, Jeff. Andrew from the Big Island. One small observation, then I'll have a question. Folks seem to be taking a lot of liberty with their questions, dragging on and on. I might ask that folks be a little more concise. It might help you get back to the business of flying and help the podcast tighten up a little bit on the ends, so it's something that I could digest all at once instead of breaking it up across many different days. So, here's my question. Why would United and Lufthansa, with United operating a 747-400 and Lufthansa operating an A380, both from San Francisco to Frankfurt, have two distinctly different patterns on the routes that they take? Looking through many different days' actual flight paths for both those airlines on that route, I see that the United 747-400 spends a lot more time in the U.S. and Canada, southern Canada, below or south of Hudson Bay, and very rarely crosses over the tip of Greenland or Iceland on its way into Europe. That's quite a ways further south than the Great Circle routing. It often adds 500 or more miles to the route. Lufthansa's A380 tends to take a route that's a lot more faithful to that Great Circle direct distance. I'm wondering what factors would play into those differences, if it's merely the aircraft's capabilities or airline policies, pilot preference, or some other air traffic control reason that I'm not familiar of. I would really enjoy seeing a little bit of Greenland, even if it's the wee hours of the morning when we pass over it, or have a better chance of seeing the northern lights from my seat in those northern latitudes. Thanks, Jeff.
Well, thank you, Andrew, for the comment that you started with, and then your question. And I was scratching my head myself, wondering, what could be the difference there? Maybe the Germans aren't invited to spend as much time in the United States and no, I'm just kidding. I don't think it has anything to do with international relations. I think it has, well, you know what? I decided that I had no idea, but I do know somebody who listens to this podcast and who happens to be a dispatcher by profession, and that he may have some idea of why it is that Lufthansa and United have such different routings over time. And so, Mike, take it away.
Cam, Jeff, thanks for forwarding Andrew's question on. Andrew, that's very observant of you seeing the difference between the Lufthansa A380 routing and the United Airlines 747 routing between the two, between San Francisco and Frankfurt. There's a couple of things that go on when we're planning an international flight like this. First of all, the first thing that we have to look at is these are two separate airlines. They're not using the same flight planning system to plan the flight. Also, they don't have the same type of personnel. United, being an FAA American-based carrier, requires an aircraft dispatcher to sit there, work up the flight plan, and be in constant contact with the crew the whole way. Lufthansa, being a European carrier, the European regulations don't require aircraft dispatchers. There are very few airlines in Europe that actually have licensed dispatchers working for them and working up their flight planning, and there are some airlines in Europe that have adopted the U.S. model, which I feel is the safer model for airlines. But actually getting back to the routing and things like that, the Great Circle route is always the shortest distance between 2 points. That is, no doubts about it, the shortest distance route. But that's not always the best route, especially on an eastbound flight like this, where you have the jet stream to push you all the way to Europe, where it might be more fuel efficient and more cost effective to fly the 5 to 8, sometimes 1,000 miles out of the way, to have 100 to 200 knot tailwind the entire way across, opposed to, the shortest distance where you would, in some cases, could actually have a headwind across. So that's why sometimes you'll see that this routing will be further south. Also, overflight costs. In Canada, it costs money to fly through their airspace. In the United States, we don't charge an overflight fee. So any overflight, any flight time that's in the United States is essentially free. And once you hit the Canadian border, you start paying overflight charges as well. Another difference is turbulence. I know some of the dispatchers at United, and especially where we work here at Acme, we will plan around turbulence. I know there are some European carriers that don't do that, where we will actually give them the same meteorological information that we use here at Acme because they pay for it, and yet they still fly their airplanes through the very rough, moderate to potentially severe turbulence that we are planning to avoid. So those are some differences and why you might see a little bit changes in the route. And you can do that pretty much with any airline, even just domestically. Why does one airline fly this routing on a transatlantic transcontinental flight while another airline does something differently? And even still within a single airline, it's the human factor of the flight planning. I might be working a flight between point A and point B, and one of my colleagues might be working another flight that we have between point A and point B, and we can get there with a completely different amount of fuel on arrival and even taking a different route because we each see something different, that both flights are legal and are safe to fly, but one of us might feel that we need to take a different way to avoid some hazards. So I hope that answers your question, and thanks, Captain Jeff, for forwarding that on to me and supporting me. Thank you.
Hey, Mike, thanks a lot for answering that question. So much better job than I could have done. And I learned so much from that answer that I didn't know about. I had no idea that most of the European carriers don't have dispatchers. That's news to me. I didn't know that. The human factor, obviously, and the Canadian overflight thing and charging for that overflight, I didn't know that either. So that's why Mike is my go-to guy, and also Tom, another associate at Acme who works in the dispatching department. And it's great to have guys like you listening to the show to help me out. And by the way, if you want to learn more about the dispatching world, and again, every time I read a blog post by Mike, I learn something new. And you can learn more yourself by heading over to my50%.com. I'll have links to Mike's excellent blog in the show notes. Thanks again, Mike. All right. Let's go over here. I'm looking at the screen here. Okay. I was looking at something in the upper left-hand corner, and I thought, does that mean my battery's about to die? But it's something else. So just a little distraction. You know how easily distracted I am. Ray, my neighbor in Alpharetta, sent me a link. He says, I bet you wish you flew in South Africa. Very big grin. I'm assuming that's what VBG stands for. And then he sent me a link to a video of this stadium in Johannesburg where an MD-80-something series airplane is making a very low pass over the stadium. I'm thinking, I know for sure we'd never get away with doing that in the States. And so that must have been fun for that aircrew that did this. So I'll put that link in the show notes. You may want to check out the flyby of the Mad Dog in Johannesburg. Thanks, Ray. Let's see. Socks in Bradenton wrote and said, talked about the episode a few back and talked about paint jobs and such. Sent me a bunch of links to various paint jobs. And he says he listens to my podcast through Stitcher. And I think Jesus said that he does as well. I wonder how many of you listen to my show via Stitcher, how many of you listen via audio download, and how many of you are out there watching my videos. Just curious. I'm glad that I'm a partner at Stitcher, and I'm glad that you guys are able to listen to me there. Okay, Andrew Conley. He is the Chief Executive Officer of SkyWest Virtual Airlines. He says, I've been listening to your show for quite a while now and have been hooked. I'm currently a student pilot at KCRQ, I'm not sure where that is, and have a passion for aviation. I currently run a virtual airline based off of the regional airline SkyWest. My goals are to go to an aviation college to get my commercial license and fly for a regional or mainline airline. What equipment do you normally fly? I've been in a 737-800 simulator in Anaheim, which was a great experience. Thanks for a great show. Blue skies, Andrew. Thanks, Andrew. I guess KCRQ must be one of the airports in the San Diego area, because he says he's from San Diego. The airliner that I normally fly, or equipment that I normally fly, is the MD-88 and MD-90. And at Acme and at most major airlines, at least here in the United States, you are qualified to fly one category of airliner. So, for instance, at Acme, if you flew the 757, you'd also be qualified to fly the 767 in all its various models. Well, not all of them, but most of the models of 767. And that's it. So if you want to fly a different airplane, you have to put a bid in to say that you want to move to another airplane, and you can also at the same time say, I want to fly it at this base, and that sort of thing. And if you have the seniority, then you are awarded that bid to the other airplane that you want to fly, and then you go to training on it, and then you go out for your initial operating experience, and then if everything goes well, then you're on your own. So that's the way it works. So yes, I fly the Mad Dog. Thanks for your feedback, Andrew. Let's see, Antoine writes, he is from Switzerland. He says, first of all, I would like to thank you for your great podcast. I've only been listening to podcasts for about a month, and your podcast, along with the Airplane Geeks, are a highlight of my daily commutes. Thank you, Antoine. I agree. Airplane Geeks, a great podcast. There are also some other great airline aviation related podcasts. Actually, too many to mention because there's so many good ones out there. But I do appreciate you listening to mine. I'm writing to you regarding something you said in episode 86 regarding the time in between two airplane takeoffs in answer to a question that was asked by another listener. The phenomenon is called wake turbulence, the spacing in between two aircraft taking off, two aircraft landing, and also one taking off after another landing is called wake turbulence separation. In fact, it does not only apply to runways, but also to regular airspace, even though it is not usually a problem since wake turbulence separation is often less than required radar separation. It is also less critical as airplanes are further away from the ground. I agree with all that. It is measured in time for runway movements and in distance for cruise traffic. You will find a few tables on page 9 of the following document, and then he has a link to skybrary.aero, and then a bunch of other stuff. I'm not going to state, but I'll have the link in the show notes. It's a PDF document, and I believe this is a document issued in Switzerland, but it talks about wake turbulence separation. And so he goes on talking about wake turbulence and such, which I've talked about several times on the show. And let's see, his last paragraph here, also the Boeing 747, despite being called the jumbo by just about everybody, is not wake turbulence category jumbo. It is wake turbulence category heavy. The Airbus A380 is the only aircraft in the wake turbulence category above heavy. which is flight planned as J for Jumbo, but uses the radio keyword Super. Even the Antonov 225, the AN 225, does not use this wake turbulence category, despite the fact that it is heavier. Interesting. I didn't know that. So again, I'll have a link to this document published in, well, actually this one is a New Zealand document, the Civil Aviation Authority of New Zealand. Cool. Okay. So lots of good stuff in there. Thanks, Antoine, for your feedback. All right. Now my phone is saying that it's almost full. Well, that's not good. I guess that means I'm going to have to stop. I'm going to have to pause momentarily and reset everything. So this is a good time for me to break anyway. I need to get ready to head over to Theodore's to meet with Jesus, and if I have a chance after I get back tonight, I'll finish this darn thing. If not, I'll do it tomorrow in my layover in Tampa. So hang in there. Don't go anywhere. Hey, I'm back. And as I mentioned on the first part of the show, that I may or may not end up completing the episode that day. You'll remember that I went to, well, yeah, of course you remember because it just happened. Went to meet up with a listener, Jesus, in Springfield at Theodore's Booze and Barbecue or something like that. Really, really good place, great food, and very good beer, and of course, even better company, as always. So got to learn a little bit more about Jesus and his flying and his job, and a fascinating guy. Thanks, Jesus, for treating last night. I really enjoyed it. So maybe I can meet you, listener, sometime out there. I try to let people know where I'm going to be and try to arrange for things like that. So yeah, let's get on. Oh, by the way, I have my timed playlist running again. So I have a little under 20 minutes remaining in the show, and the music is going to start playing in the background when it's time for me to start wrapping up the show. So I'm going to try to get a little bit more feedback answered and questions answered here in the time we have left, so that the total package will be about an hour and a half. That's what I'm shooting for anyway. Today was another great day, great weather. We flew from Bradley International to Minneapolis, St. Paul, and then here to Tampa. And I'm now in the hotel room, the studio. What room am I in? I don't remember. Had to look at my key, and I don't have it accessible right now. But I'm in my Tampa studio right now. And after I finish this recording, I'll meet up with my co-pilot downstairs, have probably a nice IPA, maybe a salad, because I've been really eating more than I should on this trip, if you know what I mean. All right, so another great day. Some crosswinds, but I do love crosswinds, as long as they're not too gusty, because I just seem to get a better landing when I can lower the wing into the wind and the upwind gear touches down first. And I guess it just makes me work harder when I'm, working with the crosswinds. So I do love crosswinds. So without further ado, let's continue with the show. So Darren made a comment on one of my YouTube videos. He says, "Hi, Captain Jeff. My name is Darren, and I live in the UK, and I've just started to watch your podcast on YouTube, and I have a question for you. Last month, September, of course, that's 2 months ago now. He sent this to me a couple weeks ago. I took a flight with EasyJet, a budget airline here in the UK, from London Stansted to Edinburgh. That's Edinburgh, I think, right? A flight of about 1 hour. The plane arrived at Stansted. People were getting off at the rear of the aircraft, and we got on the front. And this was 20 minutes before departure time, giving the crew only 20 minutes to prepare the plane. As a pilot yourself, can you turn a plane around in just 20 minutes? Another thing I've heard people say that your podcasts are too long, but I don't think so. I don't think they're long enough. Well, here is to you, clear sky and smooth flying." Thank you, Darren, for leaving a comment on YouTube. And yes, it is possible to turn a plane around in 20 minutes. And of course, we use that term turnaround by meaning that we can offload, onload passengers, bags, and everything else. Now, it's pretty tough for a major legacy carrier like the one I work for to do it in less than 30 minutes. Sometimes we have built-in scheduled turnarounds of 40 minutes, and that's pretty tight because you got to get all 150, 160 passengers off and their bags. Sometimes that's the thing that is the most time-consuming. The ramp workers pulling off the luggage and then loading the luggage for the next flight. As far as the pilots and what we do as far as doing our pre-flight and everything, we can knock that thing out in 10 minutes or so, or less. Now, the thing that may end up taking us a little bit more time is when we have maintenance issues or maintenance carryover items, and then we have to look in the book. We have this big orange book of maintenance. I forgot what the exact MDM stands for, but anyway, it's a big maintenance book that we look for carryover items and see, how many of that item we have installed, if we can go without it, how many we have to have, what restrictions we have, etc. We have to make sure that the maintenance is accomplished within a certain amount of time, and to make sure we haven't exceeded that time, etc. So there are a lot of things to check, and if you have more than one of those maintenance carryover items, it does take some time. So that's probably one of the things that could possibly keep us from doing a really, really tight turnaround as far as we pilots. But as far as if everything's working okay, we don't have any write-ups to worry about, one of us will go and do the walk-around, and the other will, is usually the pilot flying, will load up the flight management system and do all the checks of the overhead panel and other items that we have to check between flights. And yeah, we can do that pretty quickly, actually. So yes, it's doable. Thanks, Darren. Let's see, what else did you say? Yeah. So thank you for your comments, and keep listening and keep sending in feedback. All right. Now, Nick Carson writes, here's more feedback for your podcast. Like I really need more feedback, Nick. Come on. Leave me alone. No, I'm just kidding. This will be the first part of 2. Okay, and again, he sent this back to me the end of October. Number 1, I don't know if you're aware of it, but one of the most popular routes for US Airways is Phoenix to Las Vegas. US Airways flies the route with the A319, A320, and A321. And with all the times I flew this route, 98% of the time, all the flights were jammed to the fullest. The question is, why don't they, US Airways, fly only the A321s back and forth to Las Vegas and back? I know you probably won't something this one as you work for Acme and not US Air. Well, I can tell you in general, as far as this first question is concerned, that marketing at most of the airline companies are the ones that come up with the schedules, and they decide what airplane to use, the time of day. They look at crew resources and other factors as well, and they try to match the route with the airplane as best they can. Sometimes it means you have to deal with some compromise. Why wouldn't they use the bigger airplane on all the flights? Because, as you said, they're always jammed. Well, I've had that question a lot myself at Acme. We had a route that went from Oklahoma City to Dallas several years ago, and I think it was like 8 or 9 round trips per day, and every single flight was packed. But Acme decided to stop serving that route. And we're all wondering, scratching our heads, why? The airplane is always full. Well, somebody was telling me that they talked to somebody in the route management or marketing, I'm not sure exactly what the department is called, and they said it may on the surface seem like, because the airplanes are packed, that we'd be making money hand over fist over that route. But what they do is they look at the airplane and the crew and the costs involved and decide you know what? We could use that airplane and those crews on another market segment that has a higher yield. It's all about yield management. And so they weighed that route between Oklahoma City and Dallas and decided, no, you know what? Let's use all these airplanes and crews on a different route. So I guess I just have to take their word for it that that's the best way to manage everything, and it all works out in the end. But, you know, on the surface, it just doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. So that's the best I can do with that answer. Let's see, your second question. Why are runways around the world set in feet and not anything else, like meters? I think there are some places around the world that they do express the runway length in meters in the metric system, and then we have tables in our manuals that give us conversion factors so we can equate that into feet because all our data is based on feet. Why? I have no clue. I really don't, because measurements or units in aviation run the gamut from feet, that English system of measurement, to the metric system, like the weather observations, are usually given to us in like Celsius instead of Fahrenheit for the temperature. Let's see, what else? The visibility is usually given in feet. The cloud height is usually in feet because we use feet for determining altitude, and this is in the United States and a lot of the countries around the world. Most countries in the world, I guess. I guess it's the same reason why is English the international language of aviation? Well, because somebody decided a long time ago that English is going to be the international language of aviation. And they, I guess at the same time, decided that we're going to use this unit of measurement for determining altitude, for determining temperature, for determining runway length, etc. That's the best I can do with that one, Nick. Number 3, I've noticed that US Airways has IAE and a CFM mix on their Airbus fleet, ranging from the small A319 to the A330. Why would this be? Would this be because of the America West US Airways merger back in 2005, since America West had the IAE engine fitted on the narrow-body Airbuses? I'd say yes. A lot of the time, airlines will try to keep the same type of engine on its entire fleet. It makes things simpler for maintenance and overhaul, etc. But sometimes we end up merging airlines together, and you have a mixture of fleets and a mixture of engine types, and sometimes the best laid plans just don't work out, and you just have to deal with the engines that happen to be fitted on that particular airplane. I know at one time Acme was trying to go to an all one engine kind of fleet and all one manufacturer, just to try to simplify things as much as possible. But over time, mergers, etc., the need for buying another airplane to help out capacity, and so this airplane is available from this airline company, but they fitted their airplanes with a different type of engine. So the airline just goes, well, it's not ideal. That's not the way we really want it to work, but we're just going to have to work with that constraint. So I'd say that that's why the airlines run with different engine types. Okay, and part 2 of Nick's feedback. His first question on part 2, I noticed on Delta Airlines, Boeing 757-200s and domestic Boeing 767-300s, pilots use flap setting 5 on their flights. Why won't they use a higher amount if they need to? Well, I can't speak for Delta because I fly for Acme Airlines, but I can tell you that it's likely that they're not always using flaps 5. And I'm assuming you mean for takeoff, because that would be a very, very small flap increment for landing. Of course, I don't know, is that 5 degrees? Or I don't know the Boeing 7576 flap settings, and if we're talking about takeoff or landing. I can tell you that for takeoffs, the many airlines use something they call a flexible flap setting or a variable flap setting. And when the data comes in from the passenger load and all the cargo loaded, the luggage, etc., how it's distributed in the cargo compartments, all that data gets fed to a department called load planning, and they determine the most efficient takeoff performance settings. And so sometimes you'll take off with, let's say for my airplane, for instance, a normal takeoff flap setting is flaps 11. But sometimes we'll go out and see that our performance is based on flaps 5, which means a longer takeoff roll. But apparently that works out to be a more efficient takeoff setting for performance and saving fuel. Sometimes we have to take off in a very short space, and we're very heavy, let's say LaGuardia, for instance, and it's a warm day, and we have a pretty heavy load, and of course they have pretty short runways, and our performance data may, instead of being flaps 11, may use flaps 18, which allows us a shorter roll, and so we can get up off the runway as soon as possible. So that's flex flap settings that are in use in a lot of different airplanes or airlines. For landing, usually an airplane will have more than one set flap setting. Most of the airplanes that I've flown have 2 landing flap settings. And depending on the company and their philosophy, and of course for us pilots, depending on the actual circumstances. Is it a long runway? Is the terminal at the end of the runway? Are we relatively lightweight? I'm not worried about any stopping performance issues. Well, I'm probably going to be using the lower flap setting, which means a higher speed on final. It means more energy to get rid of when you touch down and start using your reverse thrust and braking. But if it's a 10,000-foot runway and you don't really need to worry about stopping toward the first part of the runway, then yeah, we'll save some fuel. Use a lower flap setting. In this case, on the airplane that I fly, flaps 28. Now, if you're landing someplace and it's a short runway, or let's say it's wintertime and you have some ice on the runway or snow on the runway, stopping is a concern. Or maybe it's a long runway, but the terminal is at near the first part of the runway. So the longer you go down the runway, the longer it's going to take to taxi back to the terminal. That may be an instance where the use of the larger flap setting, putting out more flaps, would make sense. Probably going to take a little bit extra fuel, but in the long run, it's a more efficient operation using the flaps 40 setting on my airplane. So that is a factor in determining flap settings for landing. So hope that gave you an idea of why we use different flap settings. Again, I don't think that the question you asked, I don't think that Delta on their 7.5s and the 7.6s always use a set flap setting. I think that they have variable flap settings. Number 2, why do airlines change their livery if and when merged? Well, I think that's a marketing thing. I think that the marketing folks think that it's really, really important that you have a seamless, a standard, unified brand. So if you have airplanes from, let's use the example or the question that you used earlier about the America West and the US Airways merger. Well, at first, you'd see US Airways airplanes with their paint jobs, and you'd see America West airplanes and their paint jobs. And of course that was right after the merger. But as time went on and they needed to repaint the airplanes, let me turn that volume down a little bit. It's a little bit too noisy here. So that was supposed to come up really, really nice and softly, but it turns out that it was louder than I expected. Okay, there we go. So as time goes on, and when the airplanes need to be repainted, then they are repainted in the new livery. And sometimes, even before it's necessary for them to be repainted, the airline will go ahead and repaint the airplane in the new paint scheme to kind of show the public hey, we are now the merged airline. We're unified, we're one, and this is our new paint job. So I think that's why. All right, let's see. I think you had some other... Well, you know what? That's about all I'm going to be able to do, Nick, on your feedback. Thanks for listening. Thanks for sending in feedback. Remember, folks, you too can send in feedback by heading over to, well, you can go to the Airline Pilot Guy site, and you can leave some feedback by hitting the leave or send me voicemail or send me feedback. I forgot what text I used there, but use the speak pipe option there, that tab on the right side of my website. Or you can use your cell phone. These things have fantastic voice recording applications on them. And so you can do that and attach it to your feedback at airlinepilotguy.com email. There's so many ways to send me feedback. Just check out the website. You'll see it all there. Well, I guess the music stopped, so it's time for me to go. So take care and God bless.
Good day. This production is affiliated with SQPN, the StarQuest Production Network, leading the way.